The hospital was always loud in a way that never truly stopped. Even during the quiet hours of the night, there was a constant rhythm of footsteps in the hallways, distant monitors beeping, and doors opening and closing with rushed urgency. In the middle of all this movement worked a paramedic who seemed almost invisible to most people who passed by her. She was not invisible because she was unskilled or unimportant. It was quite the opposite. She was always present, always reliable, and always exactly where she needed to be. But there was something about her quiet nature that made people overlook her unless they needed her directly. She did not speak more than necessary. She did not draw attention to herself. And she never seemed interested in being part of the loud conversations that filled the staff rooms. Each morning, she arrived before most of the hospital had fully woken up. She would change into her uniform, tie her hair neatly, and take a slow moment before starting her shift. It was a small habit, almost like she was preparing herself for something important that only she understood. Then she would step into the emergency wing, where chaos often waited behind every door. Her colleagues respected her, but not everyone understood her. Some thought she was too quiet to be confident. Others assumed she was just doing her job without much passion. A few even forgot her name entirely, despite working beside her almost every day. But when situations became difficult, when confusion filled the room, it was often her decisions that brought order back. She never argued when others dismissed her ideas. Instead, she would wait, observe carefully, and act only when necessary. And when she did act, it was always precise. She seemed to notice details that others missed. The slight change in a patient's breathing, the subtle shift in skin tone, the small signs that something was about to go wrong before it actually did. Despite this, she stayed in the background. She never corrected people when they overlooked her. She never reminded anyone of her experience. It was as if she had chosen silence on purpose, not because she lacked a voice, but because she believed actions mattered more than words. The hospital itself was a place where emotions often collided. Families came in with hope and fear tangled together. Doctors moved quickly, sometimes carrying the weight of too many decisions. Nurses worked tirelessly, their exhaustion hidden behind focused expressions. In this environment, everyone tried to stand out in some way, even if only to be heard or recognized. But the paramedic did not follow that pattern. She blended into the rhythm of the hospital so well that she sometimes felt like part of the building itself. Steady, dependable, always there when needed. Even the sound of her footsteps seemed quieter than others, as if she had learned how to move through urgency without adding to it. There were moments when new staff members would come and go without realizing how important she was. They would pass her in hallways without a second glance. Some would assume she was junior staff because she spoke so little. Others would be surprised when they saw her make quick decisions during emergencies, only to return to silence afterward. Yet she never corrected their assumptions. She had learned long ago that recognition was not something she needed to chase. There was a deeper reason behind her calmness, though she never shared it with anyone. Sometimes, during late-night shifts, when the hospital grew quieter and the weight of the day settled in, she would stand near a window and look outside for a long time, lost in thoughts no one else could see. Her hands always remained steady, even when situations around her became intense. It was not something she forced. It was something built over years of experience. There was a kind of discipline in her movements, a sense that she had trained herself to remain grounded no matter what happened around her. Some of the senior staff noticed this about her. They did not always understand her, but they trusted her. When something complicated came in, they would quietly look in her direction, waiting for her reaction. And more often than not, she would already be moving before anyone asked her to. Still, she never held authority over others in an obvious way. She did not try to lead conversations or take control of situations unless it was necessary. Her presence alone seemed enough to stabilize moments that were falling apart. It was as if her calmness had a quiet influence on the room, even when no one acknowledged it directly. Outside of work, very little was known about her. She did not share personal stories. She did not talk about family or past experiences. Even casual conversations ended quickly, not because she was unfriendly, but because she preferred simplicity. Her life seemed carefully divided between duty and silence. Some co-workers tried to understand her better, but she gently kept distance without being rude. It was a boundary she maintained without explanation. And over time, people stopped asking. Instead, they accepted her as she was. Steady, reserved, and deeply focused. Yet there were small moments that hinted she was not ordinary. Once, during a particularly stressful shift, a machine malfunctioned during a critical procedure. While others panicked for a second, she calmly identified the issue and corrected it without hesitation. Another time, she noticed a subtle symptom in a patient that had gone unnoticed by multiple experienced staff members, leading to timely action. These moments did not make her famous in the hospital. They simply passed into memory, quietly recorded in the minds of those who witnessed them. No one spoke about them afterward in any meaningful way, but they were not forgotten either. Still, she remained unchanged by them. Praise did not seem to affect her, just as criticism did not shake her. She carried herself with the same calm expression, the same quiet focus, as if she was simply continuing a path she had already chosen long ago. As time passed, the hospital continued to change around her. New staff arrived, old staff moved on, and systems were updated. But she remained a constant presence, like a thread running through the shifting fabric of the place. And yet, despite all her years of service, there was still something about her that felt unknown. Not in a suspicious way, but in a way that suggested depth. Like there were parts of her story that had never been spoken aloud. On one particular night, as another shift began, the atmosphere in the hospital felt slightly different. The usual rhythm of calm chaos was present, but there was an underlying tension, the kind that often comes before something significant arrives. She noticed it immediately, as she always did, but said nothing. She adjusted her uniform, checked her supplies, and prepared herself like any other night. To everyone else, it was just another routine shift. But for her, every shift carried its own weight, its own unpredictable turns. And somewhere beyond the hospital doors, a situation was already unfolding that would soon break the usual silence of the emergency wing, drawing attention in a way no one could fully anticipate yet. The night had started like many others in the emergency wing. Busy, slightly tense, but still manageable. The paramedic moved through her tasks with quiet focus, checking equipment, assisting where needed, and responding to small incidents that came in one after another. Nothing unusual had happened yet, but there was a strange feeling in the air, as if the calm was only temporary. Around midnight, that feeling changed. It began with distant voices in the hallway. At first, it sounded like a rushed conversation between staff, the kind that usually meant something important was arriving. Then the sound of hurried footsteps grew louder, sharper, and more urgent than before. A stretcher wheel rattled against the floor, echoing through the corridor in a way that made several people turn their heads at once. The paramedic was near the supply station when she noticed the shift. She didn't need anyone to tell her something serious was coming. She could feel it in the way the environment changed, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way doors opened faster, and the way even experienced staff began to move with tighter focus. Within moments, the emergency doors swung open. A Marine was brought in on a stretcher. He was conscious, but barely. His face showed exhaustion and pain that went far beyond simple fatigue. His breathing was uneven, and there were clear signs that his condition required immediate attention. The medical team surrounding him moved quickly, speaking in short, urgent phrases as they tried to stabilize him. The paramedic stepped forward without hesitation, though she stayed slightly behind the main group. She watched carefully, reading the situation the way she always did, quietly without interrupting. Her eyes moved from the monitors to the patient's condition, then to the staff working around him. The Marine's uniform identified him clearly. The seriousness of the situation was understood by everyone in the room without anyone needing to say it aloud. There was a heaviness in the way he was treated, a kind of respect mixed with urgency that made the atmosphere even more intense. Doctors and nurses worked quickly. One checked his vitals, another prepared equipment, while someone else tried to keep him stable as they moved him deeper into the emergency area. The room filled with coordinated movement, but also a growing sense of pressure. It was clear that this was not a routine case. The paramedic remained calm. She observed the pattern of actions, the timing of decisions, and the small hesitations that sometimes appeared when uncertainty crept in. She had seen situations like this before, where speed mattered, but clarity mattered even more. A senior doctor gave instructions, and the team responded immediately. But there was a moment when the flow of action became slightly disorganized. A monitor reading changed suddenly, causing brief confusion among the staff. Voices overlapped for a second, each person trying to interpret the situation in their own way. The paramedic noticed it before most others fully reacted. She stepped closer, not interrupting, but positioning herself where she could see more clearly. Her attention was fixed on the patient's response patterns, not the noise around her. She quietly pointed out a detail, small but important, that helped redirect focus back to the immediate concern. One of the nurses glanced at her briefly, surprised, but said nothing. It wasn't unusual for her to contribute in critical moments, but she rarely made herself visible unless necessary. Even then, people sometimes took a second to register her presence. The Marine was moved carefully into a more controlled area within the emergency unit. The room became more structured, with fewer people moving in and out. Equipment was adjusted, monitors stabilized, and the atmosphere slowly shifted from chaotic urgency to controlled intensity. Still, the situation was not simple. There were moments where his condition seemed to fluctuate slightly, causing concern among the staff. Each time that happened, attention increased and decisions were made quickly. The paramedic stayed close enough to observe but distant enough to avoid interfering unless needed. She noticed small details others didn't always prioritize: the way his breathing changed rhythm under stress, the way his body reacted subtly to adjustments, and the way certain readings responded to treatment steps. These observations were not spoken aloud immediately, but she stored them carefully in her mind. At one point, a junior staff member asked for confirmation on a procedure. The question went to the senior doctor, but before the answer was given, the paramedic quietly adjusted a setting on nearby equipment to improve stability. It was done so smoothly that it almost looked like part of routine preparation rather than intervention. No one questioned it. The Marine remained conscious in brief intervals. During those moments, his eyes would open slightly, scanning the room without focus. He seemed disoriented, but aware enough to register that people were trying to help him. His expression carried exhaustion mixed with something deeper, something like memory struggling to surface. The paramedic noticed that too. There was a moment when his gaze briefly paused in her direction. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but she felt it. She didn't react outwardly. She simply continued watching as she always did. The staff continued working. Time in the emergency room never moved normally during cases like this. It stretched and compressed in strange ways, depending on the intensity of the situation. Minutes felt longer, yet decisions had to be made in seconds. At one point, a small complication arose. The team responded quickly, adjusting their approach. The paramedic stepped in again, offering a quiet suggestion that helped smooth the process. It was not dramatic. It was not loud, but it helped prevent confusion from growing. Still, even with everything under control, there was something about the Marine that felt different. It wasn't just his condition, it was the way he reacted to certain stimuli, as if his body carried experiences that influenced his responses in ways not immediately obvious to everyone. A nurse nearby commented softly that he had likely been through something significant before arriving here. No one responded to that directly, but it lingered in the background of everyone's thoughts. The paramedic continued to observe, her expression unchanged. But inside, she was processing more than just medical information. There was something about the situation that felt familiar in a way she could not yet define. The Marine shifted slightly again, and the monitors responded with a brief change. The team adjusted immediately. Everything remained stable, but tension never fully left the room. For the first time that night, the senior doctor paused for a second longer than usual, looking at the overall situation with careful concentration. Then work continued, as steady as before. Through it all, the paramedic remained a quiet constant, watching, analyzing, and stepping in only when necessary. No one paid her special attention in that moment, but her presence subtly influenced the rhythm of the room. As the situation stabilized further, there was a brief lull. Not calm, but a controlled pause where everyone could breathe slightly easier. The Marine was still critical but no longer unstable in the same way as before. It was in this quiet gap between urgency and recovery that something unspoken seemed to settle in the room. The Marine's eyes opened again, this time longer than before. He looked around slowly, then paused. His gaze moved across the faces near him, then stopped. And for a moment it stayed fixed on the quiet paramedic standing slightly apart from the rest. The room didn't change immediately. No one noticed the significance of that moment yet. But something had shifted in the way the Marine looked at her. Something that would soon become impossible to ignore. And just as quickly as the moment came, it passed, leaving behind a sense that something important had just begun to surface beneath the surface of everything happening in the room. The emergency room had settled into a controlled rhythm after the initial chaos of the Marine's arrival. Machines still beeped steadily. Staff still moved with purpose. But the sharp edge of panic had softened into something more structured. It was the kind of moment where trained teams worked quietly, trusting their systems and each other. The paramedic stayed near the edge of the room again, just as she always did. Not distant enough to be unaware, but not central enough to draw attention. It was a position she naturally returned to without thinking, as if it suited her better than any other place. The Marine remained under close observation. His condition had stabilized, but not fully. There were still fluctuations that required careful attention. Every few minutes, a nurse would check readings, and a doctor would adjust treatment plans. The room stayed alert, even in its quieter state. What stood out most was the Marine himself. Even in moments of partial rest, there was tension in his expression. His face carried something heavy, memories that seemed too sharp to fade even in unconsciousness. Occasionally, his fingers would move slightly, as if reacting to something only he could see. The paramedic noticed these details without making them obvious. She had learned long ago that observation did not need to be announced. It was something done quietly, almost privately, even in a room full of people. A junior staff member mentioned that his responses were unusual. Not medically alarming, but emotionally unusual. It was the kind of comment that didn't belong in formal reports, but often came up in quiet conversations among staff who had seen too many similar cases. The senior doctor acknowledged it with a short nod, but did not dwell on it. There was no time for speculation, only stabilization and monitoring. Still, the comment lingered in the air like a faint shadow. The paramedic continued her work, assisting where needed, checking equipment, and ensuring small details stayed in order. She did not seek recognition, nor did she avoid responsibility. She simply moved where she was required with steady precision. At one point, the Marine's condition shifted slightly again. Not dangerously, but enough to draw immediate attention. The team responded quickly, adjusting settings and reviewing readings. The atmosphere tightened once more, but only briefly. The paramedic stepped in again, quietly confirming a small detail that helped smooth the adjustment process. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Yet it helped the team avoid confusion during a critical moment. After that, things returned to stability. The Marine's breathing steadied, and his readings became more consistent. The urgency in the room reduced again, but the alertness remained. It was during this calmer period that something changed in the Marine's behavior. He began to wake more fully. His eyes opened slowly, this time staying open longer than before. He blinked a few times, trying to focus. The room around him was still slightly blurred, but shapes and movement became clearer. He could see people standing around him, but he did not speak immediately. The staff noticed his increased awareness and adjusted their approach. One nurse leaned closer, speaking softly to reassure him. Another checked his responses carefully. The Marine did not react strongly, but he was clearly more present than before. The paramedic observed from her usual position. She did not move closer. She simply watched. There was something different about the way the Marine was looking around now. It was not confusion alone. It was recognition trying to form, as if pieces of memory were slowly connecting in his mind. His gaze shifted across the room once again. Past the doctors, past the nurses. It moved slowly, carefully, until it landed on her. The paramedic. This time, his stare did not move away immediately. It lingered. There was something in his expression that changed, subtle at first, then more noticeable. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in concentration. The room continued its work, unaware of the shift happening in his mind. Machines still beeped. Staff still checked readings. But in that small moment, the Marine was no longer fully focused on his condition. He was focused on her. The paramedic did not react outwardly. She met his gaze briefly, then returned to her usual composure. But internally, she noticed the change. It was not something she could ignore. There was recognition forming in his eyes, but she did not understand its source yet. The Marine's lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to speak. No sound came at first. He swallowed, struggling to gather strength. His breathing became uneven again, not from medical instability, but from emotional strain. A nurse leaned in, asking if he could hear them. He responded with a faint nod, but his eyes did not leave the paramedic. The senior doctor noticed the shift in attention and briefly glanced in her direction, then back to the Marine. There was no immediate concern, but curiosity was beginning to form in the room. The Marine finally spoke, though his voice was weak. It was not a clear sentence. It was fragmented at first, like pieces of a thought breaking through resistance. The staff leaned in slightly, trying to understand. But the Marine was not speaking to them. He was still looking at her. The paramedic remained still. Her expression did not change, but something inside her seemed to tighten slightly. Not fear, not surprise, but recognition of something she was not ready to name. The Marine struggled again, then stopped speaking for a moment. He took a shallow breath, gathering himself. The room waited quietly. Even the staff who had been working in the background slowed their movements. Then he spoke again. This time his voice was clearer. Not strong, but deliberate. He said a name. Not a personal name, but a word that sounded like a place. A memory. Something distant, yet heavy with meaning. The room did not react immediately, as it was unclear what he meant. A nurse asked him gently to repeat it, but he didn't respond to her. Instead, his eyes stayed locked on the paramedic. His expression shifted again, this time with something deeper. Not confusion anymore, but certainty forming through the fog of recovery. The paramedic felt the shift in the room before anyone spoke again. The atmosphere had changed. Subtle tension replaced clinical focus. People were beginning to notice that this was no longer just a medical moment. The Marine's breathing steadied slightly as he tried once more. His voice came out quieter this time, but more precise. Again, he spoke the same word. It was enough to make the room fall into brief silence. A few staff members exchanged quick looks, unsure how to interpret it. It did not appear in any immediate medical context. It sounded more like something personal, something tied to memory rather than treatment. The senior doctor frowned slightly, considering it, but did not interrupt. The Marine's gaze tightened on the paramedic again. And then, something changed in his expression completely. Recognition. Not vague, not uncertain. Clear recognition. His eyes widened slightly, as if a memory had suddenly surfaced in full detail. His breathing became uneven again, but this time not from distress alone. It was emotional strain breaking through. The paramedic stood still, her face unchanged, but her eyes sharpened slightly. She was now fully aware that whatever was happening was no longer random. The Marine tried to speak again. His voice was weaker now, but more urgent. He struggled, as if trying to force a memory into words that had been buried for a long time. The staff leaned closer, trying to understand, but the words were still unclear at first. Then, slowly, he managed to say something more complete. Place. A moment. And finally, a phrase that made the entire room shift in attention without anyone realizing it immediately. All eyes were now slowly turning between the Marine and the paramedic. But she did not move. She did not react outwardly. Yet inside the room, something unspoken had already begun to surface. Something that connected the Marine's recognition to her quiet presence in a way no one there fully understood yet. And just before the moment could fully settle, the Marine took another breath, stared directly at her again, and prepared to say something that would change the entire direction of the night. The room had gone quiet in a way that felt unnatural for an emergency ward. Machines still beeped, staff still stood in their places, and everything technically continued as normal. But something had shifted beneath the surface. Attention, once scattered across medical tasks, had now narrowed toward a single point in the room. The Marine was still lying on the stretcher, breathing unevenly but steadily enough to stay conscious. His eyes remained open, fixed on the paramedic. It was not a casual glance anymore. It was focused, sharp, and full of something that looked like memory fighting its way out of a locked place in his mind. The paramedic stood where she had been since the beginning. Calm, still, observing. She did not step forward and she did not step back. Her posture remained steady, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders now, something almost invisible unless someone was looking closely. The senior doctor noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere and briefly glanced between the Marine and the paramedic. He did not interrupt yet, but his expression had changed. What had started as a medical case was slowly turning into something more complicated, something personal. The Marine tried to speak again. His voice was weak, broken by exhaustion and the effort it took to form words. At first, only fragments came out. The staff leaned in slightly, listening carefully. Even the nurses who had been moving between equipment paused for a moment. Then he stopped. He took a breath, as if gathering something from deep inside him. His gaze never left the paramedic. It was as if she was the only stable point in a world that kept fading in and out around him. The paramedic remained quiet. She did not ask questions. She did not step closer. But her eyes were now more focused than before, tracking every small change in his expression. The Marine finally spoke again. This time, his voice was clearer, though still strained. He repeated the place name again, slowly, as if testing whether it was real or imagined. A few staff members exchanged confused looks. It was not a medical term. It did not connect directly to anything happening in the room. But for the Marine, it clearly meant something much deeper. His breathing became uneven again, not from physical instability, but emotional pressure. It was as if saying the word was pulling something open inside him that had been sealed for a long time. The paramedic's expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. A slight shift, a recognition of something she had not expected to surface in this place at this time. The Marine tried to lift his hand slightly. A nurse immediately moved closer, gently stopping him from straining himself. But he wasn't reaching for anything physical in the room. His movement seemed directed toward her. The paramedic noticed that immediately. Still, she did not move. The senior doctor stepped slightly forward now, sensing that this was no longer just about physical recovery. He asked the Marine a quiet question, trying to bring focus back to the medical situation. But the Marine barely registered it. His attention was locked on the paramedic. Then his lips moved again. This time what he said was more than just a place. It was a name of memory, a sound tied to something far deeper than the present moment. The room did not fully understand it at first. A few staff members frowned slightly, trying to process what they had just heard. It didn't fit into their expectations of the situation. But the Marine's reaction made it clear that it mattered. His breathing became heavier again, but not in panic. It was emotional strain. His face tightened as if he was fighting against something internal, something painful but important. The paramedic's gaze stayed fixed on him. For the first time since the Marine had arrived, her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable to someone paying attention. A small tightening around her eyes, a subtle change in her calmness. The Marine spoke again, and this time his voice broke through more clearly than before. The words were not random anymore. They carried weight, they carried memory, and they carried recognition. The room went even quieter. Even the machines seemed louder in contrast to the silence forming between people. A nurse looked toward the senior doctor, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment continue. The doctor raised a hand slightly, signaling to wait. He was no longer fully in control of what was unfolding in the same way as before. The Marine's breathing slowed slightly as he stared at her. Then, slowly, he repeated the phrase again. This time, it landed differently. The paramedic did not react immediately outwardly, but something in her posture changed. A stillness that was not just professional calmness anymore. It was something deeper, something held back. The Marine's eyes widened slightly as if he had confirmed something in his mind. He struggled again to speak. His voice was weaker now, but there was urgency in it. Not panic, but recognition trying to fully surface. The staff around him watched closely, unsure how to interpret what was happening. It was not a standard medical response. It was not something they could easily categorize. The Marine finally managed to say something longer. It was fragmented, but clear enough to shift the entire meaning of the moment. He was not just recognizing a place. He was recognizing a person tied to that place. The paramedic. The room registered it slowly. A few staff members looked at her again, this time with sharper focus. Until now, she had been just another quiet presence in the hospital. Reliable, skilled, but largely unnoticed. Now, she was becoming central to a moment none of them fully understood. The Marine's expression softened slightly, as if a heavy weight had been acknowledged rather than just remembered. He whispered again. This time it was quieter, almost fragile, but it carried certainty. The paramedic's eyes remained steady on him. However, there was now something in her expression that had not been there before. A faint crack in her composure. Not visible as emotion yet, but as recognition of significance. The senior doctor finally spoke softly, asking if the Marine knew her personally. It was a careful question, not meant to interrupt but to understand. The Marine did not answer immediately. He took another breath, and then, with effort, he said a few words that changed the tone of the entire room. It was not a full explanation. It was a reference, a shared memory, something that clearly belonged to a past none of the staff in the room had been part of. The silence that followed was heavier than before. The paramedic finally moved for the first time in a noticeable way. Not toward the Marine, but slightly to the side, as if grounding herself. Her eyes did not leave him, but her expression had shifted into something more complex now. Still controlled, still calm, but no longer unreadable. The Marine seemed to relax slightly after speaking. Not physically, but emotionally. As if saying it out loud had confirmed something he had been holding on to since the moment he saw her. The staff around them remained unsure how to proceed. The medical situation was stable, but the emotional layer added a complexity that no protocol fully addressed. The Marine's gaze softened again. He tried one more time to speak. This time, his voice was barely above a whisper. But what he said next made several people in the room go still in a different way. It was not a question. It was not a medical detail. It was recognition fully formed. The paramedic did not respond verbally, but her eyes held his for a long moment longer than before. And in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. Something that made it clear this was not the first time their paths had crossed. The room did not yet know the full meaning of what had just been revealed. But it was already clear that the story behind this moment went far beyond the walls of the hospital. And as the Marine slowly closed his eyes again, resting from the effort of speaking, the paramedic remained standing in place, her calm finally carrying the weight of something long buried, now beginning to resurface in fragments no one else could yet fully understand. The room remained unusually still after the Marine's last words faded into silence. Even though the emergency ward continued functioning around them, it no longer felt like a normal medical environment. Conversations were softer now. Movements were more careful. It was as if everyone understood, without being told, that something personal had surfaced in the middle of their work. The Marine lay back against the stretcher, his breathing slower than before. Exhaustion was finally taking over again, pulling him back toward rest. But his eyes did not fully lose focus. They still occasionally drifted toward the paramedic, as if her presence alone anchored him to something important. The paramedic stood in her usual position for a few seconds longer. She had not moved much during the entire exchange, but now there was a subtle difference in her stillness. It was not just professional control anymore. It was something heavier, something carried quietly beneath the surface. The senior doctor looked between them again, trying to understand the connection that had just revealed itself in fragments. He had seen many unusual cases in his career, but this was not about medicine alone. It was about memory, recognition, and something unfinished between two people who clearly shared a past no one else in the room knew. One of the nurses finally broke the silence with a soft question, asking if the Marine needed anything else at the moment. The question was gentle, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance in the room. The Marine did not answer immediately. His eyes were still slightly open, but his focus was fading again. Still, even in that fading state, his attention returned to the paramedic one last time. Then, very quietly, he said something again. It was not as strong as before. It was more like a final confirmation. A thought escaping before sleep pulled him under again. The words were short, but they carried meaning that no one in the room could ignore anymore. The paramedic heard it clearly. For the first time since the beginning of the night, she closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not long, just enough to steady herself. When she opened them again, her expression had changed slightly. Still calm, still controlled, but no longer distant. The Marine's breathing became steady again as sedation and exhaustion took over naturally. His body relaxed slightly, and the tension in his face eased. The immediate crisis had passed, at least medically. The staff began to shift back into routine monitoring mode, checking equipment and making small adjustments. But emotionally, nothing had returned to normal. The senior doctor stepped back slightly, observing the paramedic more closely now. He had noticed how the Marine reacted to her. He had noticed the recognition, the hesitation, the emotional strain. But he did not speak yet. Some things needed space before they could be addressed. The paramedic finally moved. Slowly, she approached the side of the stretcher, not rushing, not avoiding, but also not drawing attention. Her movements were controlled, almost careful. She checked a monitor, adjusted a small setting, and verified the Marine's stability like any professional would. But her eyes kept returning to him. Not in a clinical way. In a personal way she had not allowed herself to show earlier. The Marine was now resting more peacefully, but his expression still carried traces of memory. It was as if his mind had not fully left the moment, even if his body had. The nurses continued their tasks, but a few of them exchanged quiet looks. It was clear to them now that something important had just taken place between the Marine and the paramedic. But no one had the full picture. The senior doctor finally stepped closer to her. His voice was calm, careful, not demanding. He asked her if she knew the Marine. The question hung in the air for a moment. The paramedic did not answer immediately. She looked at the Marine again, then at the monitors, then briefly toward the floor, as if organizing thoughts that had not been spoken in a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. She did not give a full explanation. Instead, she gave a small, simple acknowledgement. Enough to confirm that there was history. Enough to confirm that the Marine's recognition was not accidental. The doctor did not push further. He only nodded slowly, understanding that whatever this was, it did not belong to the emergency room discussion. The paramedic stepped slightly away from the stretcher again, returning to her usual position. But now, even though she was physically in the same place as before, she no longer felt invisible in the same way. Something had changed in how people saw her. Even those who did not fully understand the situation were now aware that she carried a past that mattered. The Marine remained stable through the next hour. His condition improved slowly, and the urgency of medical intervention decreased. The staff continued monitoring him, but the atmosphere gradually softened as the immediate danger passed. Yet the emotional tension did not disappear. It simply settled into silence. The paramedic continued working as she always did. She assisted with updates, checked readings, and responded to small adjustments in care. She did everything expected of her without hesitation. But there was a quiet distance in her now, not from the job, but from the thoughts she was carrying. During a short break in activity, she stood near the window at the side of the ward. Outside, the hospital lights reflected faintly against the glass. The night felt longer than usual, even though time was passing normally. Behind her, the Marine rested more deeply now. But even in rest, his presence seemed to hold meaning that had not been fully spoken yet. A nurse nearby quietly mentioned that they might need to review his statements once he was stable enough to talk properly. The senior doctor agreed, but his tone suggested that he understood this was not just a medical follow-up. It was something more delicate. The paramedic heard the conversation but did not join it. Instead, she remained silent, watching the reflection in the glass for a long moment. Her thoughts were not spoken aloud, but it was clear that the Marine's words had reached something inside her that had stayed untouched for a long time. Hours passed. The Marine's condition remained stable. He was moved into a recovery area for continued observation. The staff reduced their intensity of monitoring, shifting into routine care. As things settled, the paramedic was assigned to another task in a different section of the emergency wing. She carried out the instructions without delay. But before leaving the area, she paused briefly near the recovery room door. Inside, the Marine was resting. For a moment, she simply stood there. No one interrupted her. No one called her back. It was just a quiet pause in a night that had already changed shape. Then she turned and walked away. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily as she always did. But something about her presence felt different now. Not changed in appearance, not changed in skill, but changed in weight, as if a part of her past had briefly surfaced, been seen, and then returned beneath the surface again. The Marine would recover. The hospital would return to its usual rhythm. But the moment that had passed between them would not disappear. Because somewhere in that brief exchange of recognition, a name from the past had resurfaced without warning. And even though no one in the room yet knew the full story, it was clear that the quiet paramedic was no longer just a background figure in the hospital. She was someone who had once been known somewhere else. And that past had just found its way back to her in the voice of a wounded Marine who remembered more than anyone expected. The night ended with silence in the hospital corridors. But for her, it did not feel like an ending at all. It felt like the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to return.